My name is Josephine Glazer. I'm a family physician. I currently practice in St. Louis, Missouri. Been a member of CMDA since 1992 when I was a second-year medical student, and was one of the first students who went to the Women in Medicine and Dentist conference in 94 in Philadelphia. And going into medical school was kind of God's fruition of His calling me back to the fold, and CMDA was instrumental in that process. Since then, CMDA has been instrumental in helping in that faith and medicine integration. The ministries that come alongside CMDA also helped me maintain being, a wife, a mother, and caregiver, and a physician. And those roles, I see them as callings because God has equipped me through CMDA. The journey is still tough, of course. There's been some troubling times, but just like our teachers have taught us this week, we can stand on God's truth and love and faithfulness, not just in protecting the family, but also in voicing truth and love and light in the public square.
You're listening to CMDA Matters, the weekly podcast of Christian Medical and Dental Associations. Here's your host, Dr. Mike Chupp.
Hearing testimonies from our members, just as you heard at the opening of this week's episode, is so impactful, and it motivates us here at CMDA. You could say it's fuel for our fire to keep on making a difference for Christians in healthcare and their patients and colleagues. If you are a regular listener of the podcast, then you know that we're in the middle of our year-end giving campaign. I'm happy to share with you that including the matching gift that we announced just a few weeks back, we have actually received $580,000 toward our $1.1 million target. Thank you to every one of you who've already given generously to help your CMDA during this rather financially challenging season. You are a vital part of this ministry, friends, and you bring so much encouragement to me as the Chief Encouragement Officer. I have more good news for you today. If you haven't given, there's still time, and your generosity is needed to help the ministries of CMDA remain strong and keep on growing across the healthcare landscape in the U.S. and across the globe. We still need $492,000 by June 30th to meet our $1.1 million goal. As you consider your gift, please let our stewardship team know if they can answer any questions or assist you in any way. They can be reached by calling 888-230-2637 or by email using stewardship@cmda.org. And if you give online, just visit cmda.org/give. One of the impactful ways that CMDA makes a difference is by serving you as a voice in the public square on bioethical and moral issues that impact healthcare, like the issues of assisted suicide and abortion and bioethical research, transgenderism, and many more. On this week's episode of CMDA Matters, Dr. Jeff Barrows joins me for a three-way conversation with Dr. David Prentice. He has been a most reliable consultant for CMDA, going back many years to help Dr. David Stevens to carefully navigate the ethical issues that we face in the world of stem cells. We invited him today to join us on the podcast to talk about a new and rather surprising ethical conundrum as scientists over the last 1 to 2 years have been making breakthroughs in developing human embryo models that do not arise directly from sperm and egg. Without any further ado, let's jump right into our recent conversation with Dr. Prentice. Well, I'm delighted today on CMDA Matters to have as my co-host, who's been with me a few dozen times over the last 3 or 4 years, Dr. Jeff Barrows. Welcome, Jeff.
Good to be here, Mike.
Well, today our guest, Dr. David Prentice, a PhD, who is an internationally recognized expert on stem cell research and cell and molecular biology and bioethics. 50 years of experience as a scientific researcher and professor. So welcome, Dr. Prentice.
Thanks so much. It's great to be with you again.
Well, Dr. Prentice has given us permission to call him David. So, David, I just have to tell you, I was coming out of the Supreme Court of the United States with a really good friend, long-term friend of mine, Dr. Donna Harrison, who's the retired CEO of the American Association of Pro-Life OBGYNs. And yeah, we talked for a few minutes about what we heard inside the court, but then she immediately had the next thing on her agenda was to say, Mike, CMDA and your ethics committee, you guys have got to engage on an issue. And she called them HEMS, human embryo models. And she immediately after that experience sent me an email, sent me a news article from the BBC. And so I said, we probably ought to talk. So Jeff and I talked, and here we are, Dr. Prentice, and we're delighted to have one of the world's foremost experts on stem cell research with us today.
Yeah, and David, before we get into talking in depth about these new embryonic model stem cells, and we'll talk about terminology as well, I thought it might be helpful for our members for you to give our listeners a general overview of the various types of stem cells that are out there, if you could do that.
Would love to do it. You know, there are different types of cells, and what we usually classify them by is their source. So the one that, of course, is in the news repeatedly and made a lot of news even 20-some years ago, embryonic stem cells. As the name implies, you have to get them from embryos. Mm-hmm. And that entails actually destroying that young human life to take out the cells, put them in the lab dish, and study them. There have been a lot of claims made about embryonic stem cells. One legislator say they had the potential to cure all known maladies, which I thought sounded like a little bit of hubris there.
Just a little.
Just a little. In point of fact, after 25 years of study, embryonic stem cells have still not cured a single disease.
That continues. I can't believe it. When you were this before, you told me that, and it still continues to today, I guess.
It does. I mean, they've actually done, finally, a few clinical trials. What few publications have come out of that have been less than exciting, which is probably why you haven't heard those results in the news. Instead, you keep hearing the hype about all these things. But yeah, the bottom line is there are two strikes right away against them. Number one, we already mentioned, you have to destroy a young human life to get embryonic stem cells. Number two, they don't actually work in terms of curing any kind of disease or injury. So let me switch to what we tend to call adult stem cells. Now, you don't have to be 21 years old to own an adult stem cell. Babies have them. Teenagers, you actually have them in your body even before birth. Some people call them tissue stem cells because you tend to find slightly different variants depending on the bodily tissue, and they are scattered throughout our body. Bone marrow is a rich source. So what we used to call bone marrow transplants are actually adult stem cell transplants. Couple of key things here to contrast with embryonic. Number one, you don't have to kill the donor to get adult stem cells. In fact, about half of the transplants done now, the patient themselves serves as the donor for these adult stem cells. You can get donors from bone marrow, from umbilical cord blood, actually, which is also a rich source, or the solid part of the umbilical cord. One of my favorite sources is liposuction fat, because I figure I can be a donor there, definitely. Mm-hmm. But again, you can obtain these cells without harming or killing the donor. But the second exciting thing about them is they actually do work in terms of alleviating disease and injury. The last reference I saw indicated that there's somewhere around 2 million people around the globe who have benefited from adult stem cell transplants. So this is where the real clinical work needs to go on. There's another source I do want to mention because we're seeing it more and more in the news nowadays. It's called induced pluripotent stem cells. Now, pluripotent refers to the fact that they could potentially make any tissue type. Embryonic stem cells, sometimes referred to as pluripotent stem cells. But these don't come from embryos. These induced stem cells, or iPS cells, you take just a normal cell, like a normal skin cell, but then you induce it. You add some genes or use some chemical treatments to change its programming, kind of like reprogramming a computer. And they now start to look and act like an embryonic stem cell. They have this great flexibility and be able to grow essentially forever. But you didn't have to kill anybody to get those cells. They still have some of the pragmatic issues that are associated with embryonic, in that it's hard to get them to tame and be able to use them for a transplant. But they've been used a lot in the lab to model diseases. You can make them from anybody, from virtually any tissue. You can make them from people who have a particular disease and study the disease in the dish. And you can also put them together in ways to form what looks like normal tissues or functions like normal tissues. It's something called an organoid. You can do the same thing with adult stem cells, but you can study normal and abnormal development in the dish. You can even do chemical panels to try and decide on a drug that might be able to treat a disease. Those are the three main types. Some people will talk about fetal stem cells. You're simply getting those from earlier in development. And again, the problem with fetal, as it is with embryonic, is you are destroying a young human life. So there's an ethical component we need to be aware of for every stem cell source. And then the other part being, do they really work? Do they really do anything as advertised?
Well, Dr. Prentice, you've alluded to this, and clearly the link to destroying an embryo, fetus, unborn baby early on in human development raises a huge ethical flag. And adult stem cells, maybe not so much concern. Are there other ethical concerns in the use of embryonic stem cells?
Well, I think there can be, certainly. I mean, in trying to use them, we need to come back to another problem with embryonic stem cells I alluded to earlier, is that it's hard to control them. I mean, the advertisement, so to speak, for embryonic was that you could change them into any tissue and thus treat any disease, whether they were heart damage, whether it was a stroke, so you're making brain tissue, whether it was diabetes, you're making pancreatic beta cells and whatever. What they have found, and again, it's been 25 years that they've been working on human embryonic. They've actually been working on animal embryonic, in particular mouse, since 1981. They have still to be able to get a purified collection of a particular cell type in the dish. The cells like to grow. They share most common attributes with tumor cells. And so trying to treat someone brings up both a practical and an ethical issue. Am I going to give you these cells to hopefully treat a disease? And then am I just going to cause a cancerous growth in your body? So, you kind of have a double whammy against them. Ethically, of course, destroying a young human life, that's obviously a big ethical problem. But ethically, trying to treat someone with a cell type that you know may not work and actually may cause other concerns and problems for your patient.
Well, with that excellent background, thank you for that, David. I guess a relatively new entity has emerged, and it's being called the Human Stem Cell-Based Embryo Models, or SCBEMs, among other names. So can you give our listeners an overview of this new entity?
Sure. And let's pull back just a second, and why are they doing this? This is another attempt to come up with something that is an embryo, essentially, a different way to make an actual embryo or an embryo-like type of construct, but trying to move away from an actual embryo, an actual life that you would have to destroy in the research, whether you're doing just basic research studies or trying to come up with some sort of clinical motive. So the old-fashioned way to make an embryo, egg and sperm. I'm sure your listeners have heard about that, called fertilization. And then the next step was, well, cloning, somatic cell nuclear transfer, but where you transferred the nucleus from a cell into an egg, and lo and behold, you had an embryo. This is how you got Dolly the cloned sheep and all of these other animal clones. Still done today. It's a very inefficient way, we might say, to make an embryo. And of course, to do that, you destroy a lot of embryos, even in the process of trying to get that embryo to grow. So there's an ethical problem there as well. There have been other attempts along the way, but this most recent one with these so-called embryo models is to take different types of stem cells or different subtypes of stem cells. And what do I mean by that? Well, one way would be to take a pluripotent stem cell, it could be embryonic, it could be one of those iPS cells, and try to encapsulate them in some sort of construct that would recapitulate placental tissue. In normal circumstances, you can't have that happen. It just doesn't happen normally with the cells in the dish, no matter how much you try. So what they've done is they've then isolated stem cells from the trophoblast layer, that outer layer. When we're a very, very early embryo at about 5 days old, you have a differentiation where you have inner cells that are going to form the embryo proper, and then this outer layer called the trophoderm or trophectoderm that essentially forms a shell and will be the placenta. So what they've done is try to combine those cells together in the dish, and the surprising thing is the cells actually will start to reform something that looks like an embryo, almost spontaneously, to come together and form that blastocyst structure, the cells inside with the outer layer. Now, what they've been trying to do is recapitulate embryonic development so they could study it in the lab, hence the term embryo models. Another term we've heard also is synthetic embryos, or you'll hear things like gastroloids or blastoids to recapitulate, they would say, that particular part of development. I think one thing we need to be careful of in the terminology, they're pushing for the term embryo models. There are even some practitioners of this that don't like the term synthetic, though it's used still once in a while. But I think we need to look at what is an embryo and what would we call an embryo. And if it looks like an embryo and it functions like an embryo, it's an embryo. It's not a model. The way they've put these cells together to get them to reform that structure and to recapitulate those function might be synthetic, or artificial is another term, or it might be a model of what usually happens during embryological development, especially early on. But we're really looking at a case where they are moving towards making real embryos that not just look but function as an embryo. They're not quite there yet. I think we need to be clear on that. But they really are trying to get to the point where they can have something to study in the lab that is an embryo, but is just not called an embryo, so that we don't raise all of these ethical concerns about experimenting on young human beings.
Right. So if you use the term model, somehow you might be able to sidestep accusations that this is human or early human life experimentation.
Yes,
that's what I'm hearing.
Exactly.
Before we continue with this week's episode, here's a special announcement for you. Have you encountered a difficult patient care decision at your hospital? Do you have a question about how to maintain Hippocratic traditions within your work as a healthcare professional? We know our members are looking for resources on today's top bioethical issues, and we're here to help. CMDA's Ethics Hotline is an on-call program assisting members who are facing these difficult patient care decisions or questions. The hotline is provided by a panel of Christian ethicists who also formulate CMDA's ethical position statements that are based on scientific, moral, and biblical principles. You can reach the hotline by calling 423-844-1000 or by visiting cmda.org/ethics. As Christians, we are called to speak truth into ethical issues and courageously stand up for what's morally right according to our beliefs. But in order to engage others in these discussions with grace and kindness, first we need to arm ourselves with knowledge and understanding of each of these topics. Bridging the Gap, where medical science and church meet, is a small group study developed by expert healthcare professionals. The curriculum is designed to ask difficult, thought-provoking questions as we seek the truth found in God's Word about the ethical issues facing Christians today. Topics include addictions, beginning of life, end of life, gender identity, right of conscience, and sexuality. For more information and to download this free curriculum, visit cmda.org/bridgingthegap. Let's jump right back into this week's episode.
Now, there is an international body. You talked about it when you were with us some time ago on the program, the International Society for Stem Cell Research. Tell us a little bit about that body and who they are accountable to and how politically they are charged and motivated over the years that you've been involved in understanding this body.
Well, it's an interesting group. It originally was formed when both embryonic and adult stem cells were coming of age, you might say. So 20 to 30 years ago, when people were starting to focus on this area of cell biology, they said, well, we really kind of need a group to come together. Partly it was for camaraderie. Let's exchange information. Let's try and move the science forward. But they also then decided that they would set themselves up as a quasi-regulatory body. Actually, they have no authority. They're a self-declared group who puts out recommendations from time to time on what should be allowed or what should perhaps at this point not be allowed. So again, they really have no authority. And their motivation, primarily seems to be to make the public feel at ease in terms of allowing certain types of experiments. It looks like they're putting an ethical overlay over their recommendations, but really it's just ways to move the science forward. And I know we discussed before some of the things that their recommendations have been of late, but let me remind you of a couple of ones. This is also the group that said, yes, you can experiment with fertilized human embryos up until 14 days. After that, you're supposed to kill them. You're not supposed to experiment on them. But the limit was supposed to be up to 14 days to experiment on human embryos in the lab, any kind of human embryo. We would advocate for a 0-day limit, that you just shouldn't be doing this. But for them, they put this 14-day limit in originally. Making cloned embryos and experimenting with them up to 14 days is fine. Making what we've termed 3-parent embryos, where you actually have components of DNA from 2 mothers and a dad, also was okay with them. Within the last 2 to 3 years, they have put out new recommendations, and it includes just doing away with the 14-day limit. Their recommendations basically state that as long as you can justify your experiment scientifically, wink, wink, on any human embryo in the lab, that just go right ahead. Make sure you've written down your justification that, we could learn more about early human development, abnormal development. Maybe we can improve IVF. Who knows? They routinely put out a series of justifications. Also, in their recent recommendations, again, just within the last 2 to 3 years, decided that making these human embryo models was okay. And in fact, those human embryo models could be experimented on in the lab with no ethical concern because they're models. They're not real embryos. Now, I want to point out that they just made the statement, emphatically, I might say, that these are models and not embryos. That's not what the science is showing us. In fact, less than a year ago, there were 5 different labs around the globe who produced what they called embryo models or synthetic or lab-grown embryos and got them to grow for beyond 14 days, but also to the point that some of them developed a beating heart. And other organ systems were starting to form. Now, again, my concern is that's not a model anymore. It's not just recapitulating part of an organ system or part of development. You've really got a coherent organism that you have formed. Now, the latest concern has been more about, could you actually gestate that organism? At this point, the ISSCR committees are recommending that you not do that for human embryo models, but they do say it would be okay for some of these other constructs, be that cloned or 3-parent embryos and so on. I'll just go ahead and talk about, I sent an article that came out yesterday where scientists disclosed that they were trying to gestate cow embryo models. They were trying to create functional embryos. They still call them synthetic or models, but actually get these models to grow in cow wombs with the hope that they will actually birth cows. And the scientists talked about, well, no, we don't really want to do this with humans and so on. But there was another comment where they said, everyone says it's really cool. And I admit, as a scientist, as a geek, I would go, yeah, that is kind of neat. You could just kind of mix these cells together in a dish and stir them with a stick, and voila, you've got an embryo, and you can actually maybe gestate it and have a born individual. But we need to stop and think about the ethics involved with this. Are we going to be making hundreds of thousands of human embryo models? And how long will it be before someone says, yeah, we're not interested in just studying development or trying to come up with a treatment for a particular developmental anomaly? Let's go ahead and birth these.
And make a clone army like in Star Wars, right?
It really is. And the old-fashioned way of cloning is sort of out of vogue now. They still use it for some animal situations, but it's a really inefficient way, and it uses lots and lots and lots of eggs because that's a key ingredient. Well, now if you could just take stem cells, which you can grow tons of in the laboratory, mix those together and get those to make embryos, it literally is a new way to clone. It's more efficient, and you could make lots more clones for your study or for your clone army.
Mm-hmm. And that gets into my next question, because there's going to need to be justification for this. So there was a recent article from the UK Parliament that made huge fanfare about all the research benefits that will come from utilizing these SCBEMs, including the potential for learning about early pregnancy loss, improving IVF outcomes, which are good things. But so often we have used these justifications to go into a realm that is, at the minimum, ethically questionable. So are there ethical concerns about this research? And if so, what are they?
Yes. The short answer is yes, there are huge concerns. These justifications, we're going to steady disease, we're going to steady development, we're going to improve IVF, we're going to, come up with cures for all known maladies, certain diseases, and so on. These are, frankly, just reruns of the same talking points that were made back 25 years ago about we need human embryonic stem cells from fertilized embryos. So we need to make cloned human embryos. We need to make 3-parent embryos. We need to make human-animal chimeric embryos. We're going to steady all this, and there will be such a great boon to humanity. None of that has come to pass, though many, many embryonic lives have been destroyed in the meantime. And I think you have the same concerns now with these stem cell-based embryo models. They're not quite there, but they're close enough to the point that I think we should call many of them embryos. The way they're made may be artificial or synthetic, but they are starting to look and function just like any other embryo, no matter how made. And so now we're talking about creating and experimenting on and destroying hundreds of thousands, if not millions, by the time this really gets rolling, of young human lives. There's no regulation as well on this type of research. In the US, for example, we have prohibitions against federal money for experimenting on young human beings. Most states have some sort of prohibitions, but they also will allow, in some cases, some of the early embryos to be created and experimented on. But no one really has any regulatory verbiage that addresses these embryo models. Mm-hmm. And instead, what we get are just the blanket statements that, well, they're not embryos, so just go ahead and do whatever you want. We really need to be aware that, number one, this is happening. It's coming very quickly, and we need to have some roadblocks put up so that we're not fomenting more of these embryo human experiments.
There is a silver lining to all of this that I just discovered that I was telling Jeff about before we started the interview, which is in a number of these articles. I mean, when we sit in public fora and talk about, the question is asked, especially in pro-life circles where there are pro-abortion folks around, when does human life begin? And people hem-haw around. But in almost every one of these articles about these models, there's some comment. The one in the BBC article that got this whole thing started for us, and we will have for our listeners in our show notes links to many of these articles we referred to, but I'm just going to quote, "The ambition for human embryo models is to provide an ethical way of understanding the earliest moments of our lives." Now, I want listeners just to think about that. Secular news source, the BBC, says this quote, "The earliest moments of our lives." And so many don't want to think, oh, well, when does human life begin? Well, not necessarily. These scientists are all telling us these are the earliest moments of our people, human beings, of our lives. And so I think we should just throw in the trash can when we have any conversations about when does human life begin. We all know when human life begins, and so do these people.
Yeah, they do. The truth comes out, even though they may not like to admit it, or they unconsciously are bringing that forward. There was an article, in fact, in one of the two leading scientific journals in the world, Nature, a number of years ago, and it was talking about early human development, and they titled the article, "Your Destiny from Day One." So the truth is there. The debate isn't about when human life begins. It's what value do we put on any human life, no matter how early in our life it might be.
Well, our Heavenly Father is watching. Psalm 139, 13 to 15, "You watched me as I was being formed in utter seclusion, as I was woven together in the dark of the womb. These embryo models just remind us that God watched us when we were in the dark in those early days of our lives. Dr. Prentice, thank you today for joining Jeff and I on CMDA Matters.
Thank you so much.
And I want to thank you, Dr. Prentice, for being one of the scientists that will keep a close eye on this and keep us informed, along with other organizations like the Charlotte Lozier Institute. We very much depend on you and your knowledge and expertise in this area.
Thank you.
This brief conversation today with Dr. David Prentice, it only allowed us to skim the surface of these ethical issues facing us from stem cell research. Specifically, this in-depth topic of human stem cell-based embryo models. If you want to take a deeper dive into this topic, I've got several resources to recommend to you today. First off is a white paper from the UK Parliament Post Note, which was the document that actually spurred on our conversation today. With references, that document is about 25 pages long, so we included it as a link in our show notes today. The second resource is CMDA's The Point blog. It's a weekly blog that highlights breaking news stories and the latest information in bioethics and healthcare. Dr. Prentice is one of our regular contributors to the blog, and he's written more than a handful of blog posts that'll help lead you deeper into the research surrounding stem cells, and specifically the problems with embryonic stem cell research. In addition to Dr. Prentice, a handful of CMDA experts contribute to this blog, and they focus on issues like abortion and assisted suicide, gender issues, and many more. Our expert contributors also recommend additional resources and information that they think will be helpful to you. You can visit cmda.org/thepoint to read more and to join that conversation. The third and final resource is CMDA's position statements, and you'll find those online by going to cmda.org/ethics. These statements are designed to provide you with biblical, ethical, social, and scientific understanding of a variety of bioethical issues through concise and compassionate statements. CMDA's Ethics Committee spends so many hours researching and crafting these statements because we place so much value on providing these as resources for our members and champions and actually the public at large. Included in the long list of positions that we take are statements specifically addressing transgender identification, homosexuality, conscience rights, and many more. Again, these statements are available by going to cmda.org/ethics. Well, I want to invite you to come back next week and join Dr. Jeff Barrows and myself. We will be joined by Mary Hassan. She is an attorney and policy expert serving at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. She actually co-founded and directs the Person and Identity Project. Mary joined us to talk more about this initiative that equips parents and faith-based institutions to promote the truth about the human person and counter the prevailing gender ideology. As I close out this week's episode, I wanted to share a quote that I discovered when I was rereading one of Dr. Prentice's posts from a prior Point blog. And it's a quote from The Abolition of Man, in which the great C.S. Lewis warned, quote, "It is in man's power to treat himself as a mere natural object, and his own judgments of value as raw material for scientific manipulation to alter at his will. The objection to his doing so does not lie in the fact that this point of view, like one's first day in a dissecting room, is painful and shocking till we grow used to it. The pain and the shock are at most a warning and a symptom. The real objection is that if man chooses to treat himself as raw material, raw material he will be, not raw material to be manipulated as he fondly imagined by himself, but by mere appetite, that is, mere nature, in the person of his dehumanized conditioners. Wow. After that illuminating quote, Dr. Prentice closed out his blog with this statement: "May we choose not to see any human as raw material, but to see every human as precious." How thankful I am, friends, for Christian scientists and researchers like Dr. David Prentice, who follow God's Word and who see every human as precious. It reminds me of that children's song, "Jesus Loves the Little Children," when it says, "They are precious in His sight. Jesus loves the little children of the world." CMDA, let's continue to see every human as precious by speaking into issues like stem cell research, no matter how difficult or complicated the subject may be. Because when you do so, you will bring the hope and healing, not of natural man, but of Christ to the world. That's what matters to us at CMDA. And CMDA matters. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next week, God willing.
Thanks for listening to CMDA Matters. If you would like to suggest a future guest or share a comment with us, please email cmdamatters@cmda.org. And if you like the podcast, be sure to give us a 5-star rating and share it on your favorite social media platform. This podcast has been a production of Christian Medical and Dental Associations. The opinions expressed by guests on this podcast are not necessarily endorsed by Christian Medical and Dental Associations. CMDA is a nonpartisan organization that does not endorse political parties or candidates for public office. The views expressed on this podcast reflect judgments regarding principles and values held by CMDA and its members, and are not intended to imply endorsement of any political party or candidate.